My name is Kinsley. I'm 36 years old, a project operations director at a mid-sized tech firm, and until recently, a wife who believed that love meant minimizing your shine so no one else felt dimmed by it. Most people would describe me as steady, calm, low maintenance. I'm the woman who remembers deadlines without reminders, who keeps a running grocery list in her head, who smooths out tension at dinner parties with a small joke and a refill of wine. At work, I'm the one executives trust with complex transitions because I don't panic. At home, I was the one who didn't escalate things. I absorbed them. If you met me casually, you might underestimate me. I don't speak the loudest in meetings. I don't announce my wins on social media. I don't correct people when they assume my husband's career was the primary one in our household. I learned early that competence doesn't need applause. But here's the truth. Silence can be misunderstood. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There was no screaming match in a driveway, no shattered glass, no secret affairs discovered at midnight. It's about something quieter, slower, the kind of erosion that happens when your growth begins to unsettle the person who once promised to grow beside you. I stayed quiet about my promotion because I knew it would start a fight. That sentence still feels strange to say out loud. A promotion is supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, a shared victory. But in my marriage, success had become complicated. My success felt like a threat in our marriage, not something we celebrated together. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how that realization unfolded, how small comments became patterns, how patterns became roles, and how, one day, I understood that silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy, not revenge, not punishment, just clarity. I won't dramatize him into a villain. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He didn't shout me down in public or forbid me from working. What he did was subtler and in many ways more destabilizing. He shifted and I adapted until I stopped adapting. This is a story about quiet dominance, about reclaiming authorship over your own narrative without burning down the house to prove a point. It's about the moment you realize you are no longer being celebrated, only tolerated. And maybe, if you've ever felt your light being gently dimmed in the name of peace, you'll recognize parts of yourself in this. Have you ever achieved something beautiful and felt afraid to share it with the person who was supposed to be happiest for you? If you asked my husband, Daniel, to describe me to someone at a dinner party, he would smile in that proud but casual way and say, "Kinsley's the organized one. She keeps us running." He meant it as a compliment. But listen closely to the wording. Not brilliant, not visionary, not driven, just organized, efficient, functional. To his friends, I was the calm wife, the stable one, the one who remembered birthdays and sent thank you cards, the one who didn't interrupt when the men debated market trends or politics over bourbon. If I added something thoughtful to the conversation, it was received as charming, surprising, even, "Oh wow, Kinsley, you really follow this stuff?" As if my intellect was a hobby I'd picked up recently. At work, I was respected, trusted. When major transitions hit mergers, restructures, product delays, I was brought into closed-door conversations. I built contingency plans in spreadsheets that most people would never see. I tracked performance metrics before anyone else realized they mattered. But at home, the narrative was different. Daniel worked in commercial real estate. Big deals, big commissions, big personality. Early in our marriage, his income outpaced mine significantly. It became an unspoken hierarchy. He was the visible engine. I was the supportive infrastructure. When my career began accelerating, it happened gradually. First, a lateral move with expanded responsibility, then a title shift, then executive exposure. The salary increases followed, not dramatically at first, but steadily. I never led with those details in conversation, not because I was hiding them, but because I was used to letting his milestones take center stage. When he closed a deal, we opened champagne. When I completed a major operational overhaul that saved my company millions, we ordered takeout and watched a show. That was the rhythm. To his family, I was so sweet. His mother once told me, "Daniel is lucky to have someone so low drama." She said it like she was praising a well-trained golden retriever. Low drama, I carried that label like an achievement badge. I thought it meant mature, grounded, emotionally intelligent. What I didn't realize was how invisibility can disguise itself as virtue. There's a specific kind of woman people are very comfortable with, the one who achieves, but quietly, who earns, but doesn't outshine, who leads, but never competes at home. I fit that mold perfectly. If Daniel interrupted me mid-story, I'd pause and let him finish. If he reframed one of my insights as his own idea later, I'd tell myself it wasn't intentional. If he joked in front of friends that I was the cautious one whenever I questioned a financial risk, I'd smile. Because technically, none of it was cruel. But perception builds identity. Over time, I noticed something subtle when decisions were being made: vacations, investments, even which couples we spent time with. Daniel spoke as if he were the final authority, not in a commanding tone, just an assumption. And we decided, he'd say. Sometimes we had decided, sometimes he had decided, and I'd adjusted. The truth is, I was deeply capable. I knew it. My colleagues knew it. My mentors knew it. But inside my own marriage, I was cast as a supportive cast, not a co-lead. And I played the role well, because part of me believed that being easy to love was safer than being impressive. Part of me believed that if I grew too visibly, something fragile between us might crack. I didn't yet know how right that instinct was. The first time it happened, it was so subtle I almost dismissed it before it fully registered. We were at a rooftop dinner in downtown Seattle with two other couples. One of Daniel's colleagues had just closed a massive deal, and the evening carried that specific energy of male celebration, loud laughter. Heavy pause, inflated confidence. Somewhere between the appetizers and the second round of drinks, the conversation shifted to career trajectories. One of the wives, Jenna, asked me what I was working on lately. I answered simply, I've been leading the operational restructuring for our West Division. It's been intense, but good. Before I could elaborate, Daniel chuckled lightly and added, Translation, she's been reorganizing spreadsheets and telling grown adults to meet their deadlines. The table laughed. It was harmless on the surface, playful, affectionate even, but something in the phrasing landed differently. Reorganizing spreadsheets? As if the scope of what I did, cross-functional leadership, budget control, performance recalibration across 3 states, could be condensed into color-coded cells. I smiled. Of course I did. I've always had a fast processing brain. I can analyze something emotionally while still performing socially. In that split second, I made the calculation. Correcting him would create tension. Letting it slide would preserve ease. So I let it slide. Later that evening, one of the men asked Daniel how he felt about me working such long hours lately. Felt about it? Not how I felt, how he felt. Daniel shrugged, half joking, as long as she doesn't get too powerful and leave me behind. More laughter. I felt that one. There it was, wrapped in humor, disguised as charm, the first small cut. Too powerful. Leave me behind. I replayed it on the drive home. The city lights blurred past the windshield, while soft music filled the car. Daniel talked about a potential listing he was pitching next quarter. I nodded at the right moments. Inside, though, I was cataloguing. Not angrily, just noting. When we got home, I asked casually, do you really think I'd leave you behind if my career grows? He looked surprised. What, babe? I was joking. I know. It just didn't feel entirely like a joke. He sighed. The way people do when they feel accused of something they don't think they've done. You're overthinking it. I'm proud of you. I just don't want us competing. Competing? That word lingered. I hadn't thought we were, but the fact that the idea existed in his mind told me something I hadn't wanted to see. From that night on, I started noticing the micro shifts. If I mentioned a win at work, he'd pivot the conversation back to his market updates. If my salary came up during tax season, he'd make a passing comment about how real estate is just more volatile, higher highs, lower lows. It was never an overt dismissal. It was minimized through tone, through humor, through reframing. And here's what's important. No one else saw it. If I described that dinner to a friend, she might say, he was just teasing, and she wouldn't be wrong on paper. But emotional erosion doesn't begin with landslides. It begins with pebbles. That night on the rooftop, something shifted inside me. Not resentment, not yet. Awareness. I realized that my growth made him slightly uncomfortable, not devastated, not furious, just unsettled. And I did what I had been trained to do my entire life when someone felt unsettled by me. I made myself smaller. I stopped volunteering details about high-level meetings. I downplayed performance bonuses. I shifted language from I led to we worked on. It felt easier, peaceful, even, but peace maintained through self-editing always carries a cost. I didn't know then how high that cost would become. The unsettling thing about small cuts is how quickly they start to feel normal. After the rooftop dinner, I didn't consciously decide to downplay myself. It happened gradually, like adjusting the brightness on a screen until you forget what full light ever looked like. When my company announced I would be presenting the quarterly strategy to the executive board for the first time, I mentioned it to Daniel over breakfast. He didn't look up from his phone. "That's great, babe," he said. "Just don't let them drown you in corporate politics." It was subtle again. A framing. Not "you earned this," not that it's a big deal, just a warning, lightly coated in skepticism. I told myself he was being protective. When I spent 2 weeks refining a forecasting model that ultimately reshaped our expansion timeline, he listened to my summary and replied, "See, that's why you're so good at being the steady one. You don't take crazy risks as I do. Steady one." I noticed the pattern forming. I was the stabilizer, the background strength, the responsible adult. And he was the bold one, the risk taker, the visible success. Roles solidified quietly. And once roles exist, people begin defending them without realizing it. If I came home energized after a powerful meeting, he'd become oddly quiet, not hostile, just withdrawn. If I expressed stress about managing a growing team, he'd say, "You wanted more responsibility." It wasn't cruel, it was distancing. Over time, I began editing myself preemptively. I'd share 60% of the story instead of 100%. I'd replace enthusiasm with neutrality. I'd soften wins into "it went fine." I rationalized it beautifully. Marriage requires balance. He's under pressure too. Not everything needs to be a headline. I became excellent at reframing my own discomfort as maturity. But here's the psychological shift that I didn't see at first. Once you normalize being slightly diminished, you start participating in it. At a networking event, someone congratulated me on a recent promotion announcement that had been shared internally on LinkedIn. Before I could respond, Daniel laughed lightly and said, "She's climbing the ladder faster than me. I might have to become a house husband." Again laughter, applause even. I smiled and replied, "We both work hard." Neutral, safe, equalizing. But inside, I felt something I couldn't fully name at the time. It wasn't embarrassment. It was dissonance. At work, I was trusted with seven-figure budget decisions. At home, my ambition was packaged as cute competition. One night, I asked him directly, "Does it bother you that I'm moving up quickly?" He paused longer this time. "It doesn't bother me," he said carefully. "I just don't want things to get unbalanced." Unbalanced. I wanted to ask, unbalanced for whom? But I didn't. Because by then, I had already internalized a subtle responsibility to protect his comfort. That was the invisible contract I'd signed years ago without reading the fine print. Be supportive, be impressive but not threatening, grow but not past him. And the more I complied, the more the dynamic stabilized. On the surface, we were fine. We still traveled, still hosted friends, still posted smiling photos from wine country weekends. If anyone had asked me whether I felt disrespected, I would have hesitated. Because disrespect wasn't loud. It was cumulative. It lived in jokes, in tone shifts, who got celebrated, and the most dangerous part. I was starting to believe that shrinking was simply part of being a good wife. There's a moment in every long-term relationship when you realize you're no longer just being loved, you're being categorized. I didn't notice exactly when it happened, but one evening it became undeniable. We were hosting dinner for Daniel's parents. I had spent the afternoon preparing everything: the salmon, the roasted vegetables, the table set with the neutral linen napkins his mother liked. I'd also wrapped up a tense work call 15 minutes before they arrived, resolving a staffing conflict that could have derailed a major deliverable. By the time I changed into a soft cream sweater and greeted them at the door, I had already lived a full professional day. Halfway through dinner, Daniel's father asked him about an investment property he'd been considering. Daniel leaned back in his chair and explained the numbers with confidence. When his father asked about risk exposure, Daniel waved it off lightly and said, Kinsley always worries more than I do. She's the conservative one. I'm the visionary. The visionary? There it was again. A title. Everyone chuckled fondly. His mother reached over and squeezed my hand. Every big dreamer needs someone practical, she said warmly. You're so good for him. Good for him. I smiled. I always smiled. But something inside me shifted into focus with uncomfortable clarity. I wasn't his equal in the story he told about us. I was his stabilizer, his risk manager, his emotional regulator, the one who made his ambitions safe. That night, after his parents left, I replayed the phrasing in my head. Visionary conservative. Good for him. Not once had anyone asked what I envisioned. At work, I was the architect of operational strategy. I saw long arcs. I anticipated collapse points months in advance. I wasn't conservative, I was calculated. There's a difference. But inside my marriage, I had been assigned a character type. Reliable, useful, invisible in her own ambition. And here's what startled me the most. I had helped build that role. Every time I downplayed a win, every time I softened my language, every time I let a joke stand uncorrected, I reinforced the script. That realization wasn't angry. It was sobering. A week later, something small crystallized it further. We were reviewing our annual finances, something I usually handled because, ironically, I was far more detail-oriented. As I walked Daniel through the investment projections I'd carefully modeled, he interrupted halfway through. Just tell me if we're fine, he said casually. I don't need the whole spreadsheet. I paused. This was the same spreadsheet format I used to guide executive decisions at work. People twice our age leaned forward when I presented numbers like these. But here, in my own dining room, it was too much. I closed my laptop slowly and said, We're fine. He nodded, satisfied. That was the moment I fully understood the role I'd been assigned. I was allowed to be competent as long as my competence served him. I was allowed to earn as long as it didn't eclipse him. I was allowed to lead as long as he remained the visible visionary. And I had mistaken that arrangement for harmony. The hardest part wasn't recognizing it. The hardest part was admitting that I had accepted it because it felt safer than challenging it. Being low drama had become my identity. The steady wife, the stabilizing force, the background strength. But background strength is still background. That night, I sat alone on our couch long after Daniel went to bed. The house was quiet. My black leather notebook rested beside me, unopened. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What role would I play if I stopped trying to make him comfortable? The answer didn't come immediately, but the question didn't leave. The day I found out about the promotion, it was raining in that steady, grey Seattle way that makes the skyline look softer than it is. I had suspected something was coming. Over the previous 6 months, I'd been pulled into higher-level meetings, asked for input on decisions that used to be far above my title. My direct supervisor had started saying things like, when you're in this next role, and then catching himself. Still, when HR sent the calendar invite labeled Executive Alignment Discussion, my pulse quickened. The meeting was short, efficient. My CEO, a woman I deeply respected, looked at me across the conference table and said, We'd like you to step into the Vice President of Operations next quarter. Vice President! The words landed quietly, almost gently. There was no dramatic swell of music, no applause, just a handshake. A compensation package slid across the table, a new level of authority that I had worked toward for over a decade. My first feeling wasn't pride. It was a calculation, not about the job, about home. On the walk back to my office, I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text him. I didn't post anything. I sat at my desk and opened my black leather notebook. Under today's date, I wrote VP of Operations, effective Q3. And then I stared at it. This was the moment couples in movies toast with champagne, the moment families celebrate, the moment your partner pulls you into a hug and says, I always knew you could. Instead, my chest felt tight. Not because I doubted myself, because I knew. I knew exactly how the conversation would go. He would smile at first. He would say he was proud. Then there would be a pause, subtle, almost imperceptible, a recalibration, questions about hours, about stress, about how this would change things. And somewhere in that discussion, even if lightly, the word balance would appear again. Or competition. Or unbalanced. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from leadership. I responded professionally, gratefully. At 5:42 p.m., Daniel texted dinner tonight or working late. I looked at the message longer than necessary. I typed dinner sounds good. That night, I cooked pasta. We sat across from each other at our kitchen island. He talked about a deal that had stalled unexpectedly. I listened, asked questions, nodded. 3 times. I almost told him. 3 times. I felt the invisible tremor of what would follow. Not a fight in the explosive sense. We didn't scream at each other. We didn't slam doors. Our fights were quieter. They sounded like tension stretching across days, like subtle withdrawal, like jokes that carried an edge. I realized something in that moment that surprised me. I didn't want to defend my success. I didn't want to manage his reaction. I didn't want my achievement to become an emotional negotiation. So I stayed quiet, not out of fear, out of observation. I wanted to see who we were without me cushioning the impact first. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I studied the ceiling and felt a strange clarity settle in. My success felt like a threat in our marriage, not something we celebrated together. And instead of confronting that truth immediately, I did something far more telling. I let it sit. Because for the first time, I wasn't shrinking. I was watching. The morning after my promotion meeting, I woke up feeling different. Not euphoric, not anxious, composed. There's a particular stillness that comes when you stop reacting and start observing. I'd spent years adjusting myself in anticipation of Daniel's comfort level. This time, I did nothing. I didn't rehearse the conversation. I didn't soften the language in advance. I went to work. I signed preliminary paperwork. I met with finance about the compensation structure. The salary increase was significant. For the first time in our marriage, my base income would exceed his average annual earnings without commissions factored in. I noticed that fact without judgment. Just data. When I got home that evening, Daniel was in the living room scrolling through listings on his tablet. "Hey," he said casually. "How was your day?" There it was, the opening. I could have said it then. Instead, I replied, "Productive." And I watched, not him myself. I was studying what it felt like to hold something powerful without immediately offering it up for evaluation. It felt steady. Over the next week, the company began internal announcements. Congratulatory emails circulated, my LinkedIn quietly updated. I knew it was only a matter of time before it reached him indirectly. Still, I didn't bring it up. Not because I was hiding it, because I was choosing the timing. There's a difference. Daniel, for his part, seemed slightly off. Not dramatically, just unsettled in a way he couldn't name. He asked more questions about my schedule, commented more often on how intense corporate leadership must be, mentioned twice how volatile his industry had become lately. I listened carefully. Silence is revealing. When you stop filling space with reassurance, people start revealing their assumptions. "One evening," he said, almost casually, "I feel like you've been distant lately." I folded a dish towel slowly before answering. "I've been focused. On work. On everything." He studied me for a second longer than usual. He wasn't used to this version of me, the one who didn't over-explain. In the past, I would have rushed to smooth it over. "I'm sorry if I seem off. I don't want you to feel disconnected. Tell me what you need." Instead, I let the silence sit between us. Not cold, not hostile, neutral. And that neutrality unsettled him more than any argument would have. Here's what I realized during those days: he had grown accustomed to me preemptively managing his emotions. If something shifted in our dynamic, I would name it first, soften it, resolve it. Now, I was simply present. The promotion announcement officially went public on a Thursday afternoon. By 6:15 p.m., my phone buzzed. Daniel had seen it. "VP since when?" No emoji, no exclamation, just punctuation. I didn't respond immediately. I was still in a meeting. When I got home, he was waiting in the kitchen. "You didn't tell me," he said. His tone wasn't explosive. It was wounded. And there it was, the beginning of the fight I had predicted. But this time, I didn't rush to apologize. "I found out last week," I said calmly. I wanted to process it first. He stared at me, trying to recalibrate. Process it or decide how to spin it to me. That comment could have pulled me into defensiveness. It didn't. Silence, when chosen, isn't weakness, it's positioning. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't trying to preserve his version of balance. I was protecting my own. When people imagine power shifts in a marriage, they picture dramatic ultimatums or explosive revelations. What they don't picture is a woman quietly building infrastructure. After the promotion became public, and after the first wave of tense conversations settled into a fragile calm, I didn't escalate. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand validation. I prepared, not for war, for clarity. The night Daniel accused me of spinning it, I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, I didn't want my promotion to turn into something we had to negotiate emotionally. He didn't respond to that. He went quiet. And over the next few days, a cool distance settled into the house. He wasn't cruel. He was adjusting. So was I. But my adjustment was strategic. I began reviewing our financial landscape more carefully than ever before. Not because I distrusted him, but because I needed a full picture of reality. I updated every account log, retirement contributions, property equity breakdown, insurance policies, beneficiary designations. I wasn't looking for leverage in the manipulative sense. I was looking for independence in the structural sense. For years, we had operated under the assumption that we were interdependent emotionally and financially, but I began running silent scenarios. What if I needed to stand alone? What if growth meant separation, not adaptation? Not because I wanted it, because I refused to be unprepared for it. I also began documenting conversations not in a paranoid way, but in my black leather notebook. Dates, phrases, emotional tone, patterns. Not for evidence in a courtroom, for pattern recognition in my own mind. There's something grounding about seeing repetition on paper. It removes self-doubt. It replaces, maybe I'm overreacting, with, this has happened 7 times. Meanwhile, Daniel oscillated between pride and subtle resentment. At a friend's birthday dinner, he introduced me as the new corporate powerhouse, but the tone carried an undercurrent, something slightly performative. Later that night, in the car, he said, I just don't want you to become one of those executives who forget how to be present. Forget how to be present, as if ambition erased humanity. I didn't argue. I asked a simple question instead. Do you feel like I've forgotten how to be present? He hesitated. No, not yet. Not yet. I wrote that one down. At work, my world expanded. I hired 2 new senior managers. I led high-stakes negotiations. I made decisions that impacted hundreds of employees, and I did it without apology. At home, I became observant. I stopped offering reassurance before it was requested. I stopped shrinking language. I stopped cushioning my schedule to appear less ambitious. And something interesting happened. Without my constant emotional buffering, Daniel's insecurities became more visible. He checked my calendar once, casually, and asked, why do you have so many late meetings lately? They're global, I said evenly. Time zones. He nodded, but his jaw tightened slightly. He began mentioning his own income, more often potential commissions, upcoming listings, hypothetical growth. It wasn't overt competition. It was comparison anxiety. And here's what he never noticed. The more he subtly positioned himself against me, the more I detached from the need to compete at all. Because competition requires 2 participants. Preparation, on the other hand, requires only 1. By the end of that quarter, I had reorganized my personal savings into an account solely under my name, increased my retirement contributions independently, consulted discreetly with a financial advisor about long-term planning structures, reviewed the legal framework of our marital assets. No confrontations, no threats, no ultimatums, just information. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It gathers. And while Daniel wrestled with the idea of balance, I was building something far more stable than emotional reassurance. I was building options. The real turning point didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in a quiet conference room, staring at a compensation projection spreadsheet. As part of my new role, I had been granted equity participation, not symbolic stock options, real, vested shares tied to long-term company performance. When our CFO walked me through the 5-year outlook, she said something that landed with unusual weight. If we hit our growth targets, this changes your financial ceiling permanently. Financial ceiling? That phrase echoed long after the meeting ended. That evening, I stayed late, not because I had to, because I wanted to think without interruption. I opened a fresh page in my black leather notebook and wrote 3 columns. Current, 5 years, independent scenario. For the first time in my life, I ran the numbers assuming I was solely responsible for myself. Not emotionally. Structurally, salary trajectory, equity vesting schedule, retirement growth, investment yield projections, housing flexibility, lifestyle sustainability. The math was undeniable. I didn't need to shrink to maintain security. I didn't need to protect his ego to protect my future. For years, a quiet, unspoken belief had lived in the back of my mind that marriage was my safety net, that no matter how capable I was, partnership was the stabilizing force. But as I mapped everything out, a different truth emerged. I was the stabilizing force. That realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt clarifying. Because if I was already carrying the emotional steadiness, the financial foresight, the logistical planning, then what exactly was I preserving by making myself smaller? Later that week, something subtle confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Daniel had a difficult month professionally. 2 deals fell through. A client backed out unexpectedly. He came home agitated, pacing slightly as he recounted the setbacks. I listened, asked thoughtful questions, and offered grounded feedback. At one point, he stopped and said, "You're so calm about everything. I don't know how you do it." I held his gaze. "I've had to be," I replied. He didn't catch the layered meaning, but I did. That night, after he went to bed, I opened my notebook again and wrote a sentence that felt both terrifying and freeing. If he cannot celebrate me at my highest, I will not contort myself to fit his comfort. That was the private reveal. Not that I was more successful, not that I earned more, not that I could survive alone, but I was no longer emotionally dependent on his validation. The promotion had exposed something fragile in our marriage, but it had also exposed something solid in me. Clarity replaces fear. And once you see your own leverage not as a weapon, but as stability, you stop negotiating your worth. The next morning at breakfast, Daniel casually mentioned, "We should probably reevaluate our long-term plans now that your job's getting bigger." The wording was interesting. Your job's getting bigger. Not you're growing, not that we're evolving, just the job. I nodded calmly. Yes, I said, we should. But inside, the conversation had already shifted. I wasn't preparing to argue. I was preparing to decide. People assume decisions like this arrive in dramatic waves. They don't. They arrive quietly disguised as ordinary evenings, folded into routine conversations, hidden inside polite disagreements. A week after Daniel suggested we reevaluate our long-term plans, we sat down at the dining table with laptops open. The air felt neutral, but not warm. He had prepared a few talking points about adjusting investment allocations. I had prepared something else. Options. I had spent the previous days running scenarios in my head, not emotionally, but strategically. Option 1. Continue shrinking strategically. Maintain the marriage. Soften my visibility. Keep peace at the cost of self-erasure. Option 2. Confront him fully. Demand change. Force the discomfort into the open and hope he rises to meet it. Option 3. Quietly restructure my life so that my happiness no longer depends on whether he can expand with me. Only one of those options was irreversible, and that's the one I chose, but not impulsively. That night, while Daniel spoke about portfolio diversification, I listened carefully to his tone. There was no overt hostility, no accusations, just a subtle undercurrent as if my growth had introduced instability. He was trying to mathematically correct. At one point, he said, "I just don't want us drifting into separate lanes." Separate lanes? It struck me how often he framed my advancement as distance. I closed my laptop slowly. "Daniel," I said evenly, "do you feel like my success pulls us apart?" He exhaled through his nose, considering. "I feel like it changes the dynamic. And is change inherently negative?" He didn't answer immediately. "I just don't want to feel unnecessary." There it was. Not competition, not resentment, fear of irrelevance. For the first time, I saw it clearly, and I didn't rush to soothe it. Because here's what I understood in that moment. His fear was not my responsibility to fix. I could support him, I could love him, I could reassure him to a degree, but I could not amputate parts of myself to keep him feeling essential. That realization didn't make me cold. It made me decisive. Over the next 48 hours, I did something that felt both terrifying and deeply calm. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney. Not to file, to understand. Information is not aggression. It's preparation. I needed to know what my options looked like if growth continued to create a fracture instead of alignment. I needed clarity about assets, timelines, structures, not because I wanted to leave that week, but because I refused to remain blind. That consultation was clinical, respectful, grounded. The attorney asked practical questions. I answered them without drama. When I walked back to my car afterward, I didn't cry. I felt steady. Because the decision I had made wasn't about ending my marriage immediately. It was about ending the version of myself who would stay diminished to preserve it. Irreversible decisions aren't always about walking away. Sometimes they're about refusing to go back. That night, Daniel asked casually, "Everything okay? You've been composed?" I met his eyes and said, "I've been thinking long term." He smiled, unaware of the layers beneath that sentence. And for the first time, I understood something powerful. I was no longer reacting to his discomfort. I was designing my future, quietly. After the consultation, nothing on the surface changed. That was intentional. Daniel still left early for showings. I still attended executive meetings. We still hosted friends on Saturdays and argued lightly about which series to watch on Sundays. If someone had stepped into our home, they would have seen a stable, successful couple. What they wouldn't have seen was the shift in architecture. I began separating what had always been blurred. First, finances. I adjusted my direct deposit so a higher percentage of my salary flowed into my individual account before touching our joint one. Not secretly, just quietly. My compensation package allowed for discretion. I exercised it. I increased my emergency fund to cover 12 months of living expenses independently. Not because I plan to leave tomorrow, because security breeds clarity. Next, documentation. I scanned and securely stored copies of every shared asset record, mortgage statements, insurance policies, tax returns, investment portfolios, not obsessively, methodically. Then came something more subtle, emotional detachment from outcome. In the past, whenever tension surfaced between us, I would instinctively move toward repair. I'd ask more questions, offer reassurance, initiate connection. Now I matched his energy. If he withdrew, I didn't chase. If he grew quiet, I allowed quiet. If he made a sideways comment about corporate ambition, I didn't defend, I observed. This wasn't punishment. It was calibration, and it unsettled him more than confrontation ever had. One evening, about a month after my promotion announcement, we attended a networking event together. A senior partner from my firm introduced me to someone as the strategic backbone of our expansion. I felt Daniel stiffen beside me. "On the drive home," he said lightly, "you're getting a lot of attention lately." There was something loaded in the word attention. "Yes," I replied evenly. "It comes with responsibility." He glanced at me. "Just don't forget where you started." I turned my head slowly to look at him. "I haven't," I said. "Have you?" Silence filled the rest of the drive. In the past, I would have softened that exchange, touched his hand, laughed it off, made it safe. I didn't. Not because I wanted distance, but because I refused to collapse truth into comfort anymore. Meanwhile, I continued refining my independent strategy. I met with a financial planner under the guise of executive wealth structuring, which, technically, it was. I reviewed potential housing scenarios. I calculated tax implications under different marital statuses. Every action was legal, transparent, thoughtful. No hidden accounts, no dramatic ultimatums. Just readiness. And here's the interesting thing about moving in silence. People sense it. Daniel began trying, in small ways, to reassert familiarity. Planning spontaneous date nights, bringing home my favorite wine, complimenting my work ethic. But the compliments felt newly cautious, like he was testing whether admiration would restore equilibrium. I appreciated the gestures. I didn't lean into them, because my clarity wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by recognition. For years, I had worked to preserve a version of us that depended on my moderation. Now, I was building a version of myself that didn't require anyone's permission to expand. One night, he asked softly, "Are we okay?" I paused before answering. "Yes," I said, "we're evolving." He nodded slowly. He didn't realize evolution isn't always mutual. Some transformations happen internally first, and by the time they become visible, the decision has already been made. The first consequence wasn't loud. It was subtle, like air pressure shifting before a storm. Daniel started losing something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't my affection. I was still kind, still respectful, still present. It was access. For years, he had full emotional access to me, my self-doubt, my ambition, my anxieties, my internal processing. I had offered it freely. I had believed transparency was intimacy. Now, I filtered, not dishonestly, just selectively. If I had a high-stakes board meeting, I didn't pre-discuss my nerves. If I closed a strategic hire, I didn't unpack every detail at dinner. If I felt uncertain about a decision, I worked through it independently first. He began asking more questions. You didn't tell me that was happening. When did you decide that I feel like I'm hearing things after the fact? Each time, I responded calmly. I've been handling it. And that answer, simple, factual, unsettled him, because it implied something he wasn't ready to confront. I no longer needed him as my stabilizer. At first, he tried to regain familiarity through subtle control. He questioned our shared calendar more closely, asked why certain expenses were categorized differently, suggested we simplify our financial structure. I just think things felt more unified before, he said one evening. Unified? I understood what he meant. Before, my growth had been woven into his narrative. My achievements reflected well on him, as long as they didn't exceed him. Now, my trajectory felt autonomous. And autonomy feels like a loss to someone who benefited from your dependency. The tension showed up socially too. At a friend's housewarming party, someone congratulated me again on the VP role. Daniel smiled, but this time he added, "Yeah, she's basically running the world now. I just try to keep up." The room laughed. I didn't. I turned to him gently and said, "You don't have to keep up with me." It wasn't sharp, it wasn't cruel, but it landed. He went quiet for the rest of the evening. On the drive home, he said, "You used to lighten those moments." "I'm not responsible for making you comfortable with my success," I replied evenly. There was no shouting, just truth. And truth, when introduced late in a dynamic, feels disruptive. Over the next few weeks, his frustrations surfaced in quieter ways. He stayed out later with colleagues, took more calls in private, mentioned potential high-commission deals with exaggerated optimism. I recognized the pattern. He was trying to rebalance the narrative, but here's what he didn't realize. The narrative had already shifted internally for me. The consequence of my silence, of my preparation, of my emotional recalibration, was that I no longer reacted to his insecurity. And when one person stops playing a familiar role, the other feels the loss. One night, after a particularly strained dinner, he said, "I feel like I'm losing you." I looked at him carefully before answering. "You're losing the version of me who minimized herself." He stared at me, processing. "And what replaces her?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Someone whole!" That was the moment the consequences became undeniable. Because wholeness doesn't negotiate its size. There's a specific tone people use when they realize something is slipping beyond their control. It's softer than anger, sharper than sadness. It's an urgency. Daniel's urgency surfaced gradually. He began initiating deeper conversations, the kind I had quietly hoped for months earlier. "Have I made you feel unsupported? Did I not celebrate you enough? Is this about the promotion?" 6 months ago, those questions would have opened something tender inside me. I would have felt relief, gratitude, hope. Now I felt steady, because timing matters. Repair offered only after distance becomes visible often isn't about growth, it's about preservation. One evening, he sat across from me at the kitchen island, hands folded in a way that felt unfamiliar. "I don't want us drifting apart," he said. "Tell me what to fix." Fix! As if the problem were mechanical. I considered him carefully before answering. "It's not one thing." I said, "It's a pattern." He nodded quickly. "Okay, then I'll change the pattern. But here's the part that's hard to explain, unless you've lived it. By the time someone is ready to change, you may already be done needing them to..." I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I asked, "Why now?" He hesitated. "Because I feel you pulling away." Honest, but reactive. For years, I had felt the subtle pull, the minimizations, the reframing, the quiet competition. When I voiced concerns then, they were softened, dismissed as overthinking. Now that the distance was tangible, he wanted immediate repair. But emotional erosion doesn't reverse on demand. Over the next few weeks, he tried harder. He complimented me publicly sincerely this time. He asked detailed questions about my work. He suggested couples therapy. And part of me appreciated it. But another part of me observed something important. His effort was driven by fear of losing me, not by understanding who I had become. In therapy, yes, the counselor asked a simple question. When did you start feeling like competitors instead of partners? Daniel looked at me. I answered calmly. When my growth started feeling like a threat instead of something we celebrated together. The room went quiet. He didn't argue, because he knew. The sessions were respectful, constructive, insightful even. But every time we left the office, I felt the same quiet certainty. I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was simply no longer willing to shrink. And shrinking had been the glue holding us together. One night, after a particularly raw therapy session, Daniel said softly, I can change. I just need time. I nodded. I believe you can, I replied. But he asked, but I've already changed. That was the truth neither of us could escape. He was trying to save the version of our marriage that depended on my moderation. I was stepping into a version of myself that no longer required it. And once that internal shift happens, once you taste wholeness, it's very hard to negotiate your way back into invisibility. The tragedy wasn't explosive. It was quiet. He was ready to fix it. I was ready to move forward. And those are not in the same direction. The final conversation didn't happen during a fight. It happened on a Sunday morning, in soft light, over untouched coffee. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no dramatic declaration. Just two adults sitting across from each other, finally speaking without distortion. Daniel had been quieter all week. Not defensive, not reactive, just contemplative in a way I hadn't seen before. I've been thinking, he said, fingers wrapped around his mug. I spent a lot of our marriage measuring myself against you. I didn't interrupt. And when you started accelerating, he continued, I didn't celebrate it. I calculated it. Calculated? That word was honest. I was afraid, he said. Afraid that if you didn't need me financially or emotionally, I'd become optional. Optional? I let the silence breathe between us before answering. I never wanted you to be necessary, I said calmly. I wanted you to be aligned. He looked at me, absorbing the distinction. Is it too late, he asked. There it was, not dramatic, not desperate, just direct. I didn't rush the answer, because the truth deserved precision. I don't think you're a bad man, I said evenly. And I don't think you intentionally diminished me, but I built myself smaller so you could feel bigger. And I can't do that anymore. He swallowed slowly. I'm not asking you to be smaller, he said. I know, I replied. You're asking me to stay while you adjust. Another silence. This one is heavier. I need a partner who feels proud standing next to me at my full height. I continued, not one who learns to tolerate it. He closed his eyes briefly, then nodded once. There was no argument, because deep down, we both understood something unspoken. Love isn't always enough when growth exposes incompatibility. We talked logistics next, calmly, practically. We agreed to separate respectfully, to consult attorneys without hostility, to divide assets fairly. No one stormed out. No one begged. The grief was real, but it wasn't chaotic. At one point, he said quietly, you've been preparing for this longer than I realized. I met his gaze. I've been preparing to stop abandoning myself, I corrected gently. That was the confrontation. Not fiery, not cruel, just clarity spoken aloud. We hugged before he left to stay with a friend for a few weeks. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. It was steady, familiar, final. As the door closed behind him, the house felt different. Not empty, open. And for the first time in years, I felt something that didn't require negotiation. Peace. The first night alone in the house was quieter than I expected. No dramatic soundtrack, no collapse on the floor, just the hum of the refrigerator and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I walked through each room slowly, not to grieve it but to reclaim it. For years, I had curated my presence in these spaces, softened my voice in certain conversations, adjusted my ambition in subtle ways, calibrated my emotional expression to maintain equilibrium. Now, There was no equilibrium to maintain, only truth. In the months that followed, the legal process unfolded respectfully. Papers were signed without hostility. Assets are divided with fairness. There were hard conversations. Yes, but they were contained. Adult. Friends were surprised by how calm it all seemed. "You're handling this so well," one of them said. I smiled. I wasn't handling it well because I was detached. I was handling it well because I had already grieved the smaller version of myself long before the marriage ended. Work continued to expand. I stepped fully into my role as vice president. I led restructuring initiatives that required decisiveness without apology. I traveled for leadership conferences without checking whether my schedule would feel threatening to anyone at home. For the first time, my success didn't require translation. I didn't become colder. If anything, I became softer, but in a grounded way. I laughed more freely. I rested without guilt. I decorated the living room in a style that felt bold instead of neutral. Independence wasn't loud. It was steady. There were moments of sadness. Of course, grief doesn't vanish just because the decision was right. Sometimes I'd pass a restaurant we used to love and feel a flicker of memory. Sometimes I'd wonder whether we could have evolved differently. But those thoughts didn't carry regret. They carried acceptance. Daniel and I eventually met for coffee months later to finalize a few details. The conversation was respectful, even warm in places. "I see you differently now," he admitted. "How?" I asked. "Solid," he said. "Like you're not negotiating yourself anymore." I held that word quietly. Solid. That's who I am now. Not hardened, not vengeful, not triumphant. I don't shrink from protecting comfort. I don't inflate to prove worth. I don't compete for validation. I stand. And here's the truth I wish I had understood sooner. When your growth feels like a threat to someone who loves you, it's not your job to reduce the growth. It's your job to decide whether love can expand with it. Mine couldn't, so I expanded alone. And I am not lonely. I am aligned. If you've stayed with me this long, you might be expecting a sharper ending. A moment where I say he regretted everything. A scene where I reveal I'm happier than ever, and he's struggling. A clean moral divide between right and wrong. But that's not this story. Daniel wasn't a villain. He was a man who measured his worth against proximity to mine and panicked when the numbers changed. And I wasn't a victim. I was a woman who mistook shrinking for harmony. The real turning point wasn't the promotion. It was the moment I understood this. Love that requires you to dim your ambition isn't love, it's containment. And containment feels stable until you realize you're the one holding the walls up. I stayed quiet about my promotion because I knew it would start a fight. And in that silence, I discovered something far more important than how he would react. I discovered how I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate. I didn't humiliate. I prepared. I clarified. I chose. Quiet dominance isn't about crushing someone else. It's about refusing to crush yourself to preserve comfort. If you're in a relationship where your growth feels like a negotiation, pause. Not to panic, not to accuse, just to observe. Are you evolving together, or are you adjusting yourself to maintain balance? There's no shame in outgrowing dynamics that once felt safe. There's no cruelty in choosing wholeness, and there's no prize for staying small enough to be easily loved. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It's alignment. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to know. Have you ever felt your success shift the balance in a relationship, and what did you choose to do about it?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.